Problems were brewing. As the years since the first constitutional settlement passed, it became obvious that the first constitutional settlement had not restored the Republic and had merely clothed Augustus's power in republican institutions. His consistent illegal acts kept mounting up. He was consul consecutively every year since 31 BC, which was illegal. His co-consuls were repeating as well, like Agrippa and Statilius Taurus, his friends. He had made private grievances matters of state. He had broken judicial laws, interfered with the public provinces, started promoting his relatives into the cursus honorum as clear heirs to his estates. He had monopolized military honors and glory, prevented Crassus from dedicating the Spolia Opima. Triumphs had come to an end. Cornelius Gallus had committed suicide. He had built monarchic buildings like his palace on the Palatine Hill and his family mausoleum. The Senate was seeking his approval for foreign matters which it had never done before, and created positions which even to his friends had too much power associated with them and was contrary to republican tradition. The Primus Trial and the subsequent Caepio conspiracy, where Caepio actually planned to kill Augustus to restore the Republic, just as was hoped with Caesar, were indicators of the rising resentment against Augustus's power from the aristocracy. Since juries were made up of 1/3 senators and 2/3 equites, the fact that twice they tried to fly in the face of Augustus exposes the anger of the elite against him. Something had to change, for were it to continue, further trouble was likely to follow. Things finally came to a head when Augustus fell ill from a local epidemic and nearly died in 23 BC. Rome had been flooded. His nephew and heir to his estates, Marcellus, died soon after his games as aedile. Uncertainty would have been the watchword for those times. Suetonius describes the event. Suetonius, Life of the Divine Augustus, chapter 28. He twice considered restoring the Republic. First, immediately after crushing Antonius, in view of Antonius's not infrequent accusations that it was he who was the obstacle to its restoration, and again when, exhausted by a chronic illness, he summoned the magistrates and senate to his house and gave them a summary of the state of the empire. But, on reflecting that private life would be not without risks, and that it would be rash to entrust the state to the control of a group of people, he continued to hold on to it, arguably with better results than intentions. Cassius Dio has a fuller account of the events. Cassius Dio, Roman History, Book 53, Chapter 30 to 32. Augustus became consul for the 11th time with Calpurnius Piso, as with his colleague, and was then again taken ill, this time so seriously that there appeared to be no hope of his recovery. At any rate, he arranged all his affairs as if he were at the point of death, and gathered around him the officers of state and the most prominent senators and knights. He did not indicate any successor, although everybody was expecting that Marcellus would be the first choice for this position. However, he spoke to the company for a while about matters of public policy, delivered to Piso the list of the forces and the records of the public revenues written in a book, and handed his ring to Agrippa. He became too weak to deal with even the most urgent matters, but a certain Antonius Musa restored him to health by means of cold baths and cold potions. In return for this service, Musa was paid large sums by both Augustus and by the Senate, and was also given the right to wear gold rings, for he was a freedman. He was also granted exemption from taxes, both for himself and for the other members of his profession, not only his contemporaries, but even future generations. However, fate decreed that the man who had taken into his own hands the function both of fortune and of destiny should himself become ensnared. For while Augustus's life was saved in this way, Marcellus, when he fell ill not long afterwards, received the same treatment from Musa, but died. Augustus delivered a eulogy in the traditional manner, gave him a public burial, and placed his body in the tomb which he was building. He also completed as a memorial to the young man the theatre whose foundations had already been laid by Julius Caesar, and which was now named the Theatre of Marcellus in his honour. He also gave orders that a golden image, a golden crown and a curule chair should be carried into the theatre at the festival of the Roman Games, and should be placed in the midst of the magistrates who officiate at these. These actions were carried out later. At the time when Augustus had recovered his health, he brought his will into the Senate with the intention of reading it aloud, so as to inform the world that he had left no successor to the empire. However, this reading never took place, for no one would consent to it, but what caused universal astonishment was his attitude towards Marcellus. He had shown his love for Marcellus both as a son-in-law and as a nephew, and besides conferring other honours upon him, had gone out of his way to help the young man make a brilliant success of the games which he was supervising as aedile. Thus throughout the whole summer the forum had been sheltered by means of a canopy stretched overhead. A dancer, who was a knight, and a woman of noble birth had been persuaded to take part in the stage performances, and yet Augustus had not entrusted the monarchy to him, and had given his preference to Agrippa. From this it would appear that he did not yet possess confidence in the young man's judgment, and that he either wished the people to recover their liberty or Agrippa to be given the leadership by them. Certainly he understood that Agrippa was much beloved by the people, and he wished to avoid the impression that the supreme power was being entrusted to him by Augustus's decision alone. So when he regained his health and discovered that Marcellus, not well disposed towards Agrippa because of what had happened, he immediately sent the latter to Syria, so that no occasion for friction or quarrelling might arise through their being in one another's company. Agrippa immediately left Rome, but did not travel as far as Syria. Instead, he acted with even more than his accustomed tact, sent his subordinates there, and himself waited in Lesbos. These were the actions taken by Augustus in the manner I have described. The number of praetors appointed was 10, since he considered that no more than these were required, and this figure was maintained for several years. His intention was that most of them should perform the duties as before, but that 2 should be in charge of financial administration each year. After he had given detailed instructions on these matters, he went to the Alban Mount and formally laid down the consulship. Even since the conduct of affairs of state had been regularized, both he himself and most of his colleagues had held the office for a full year. He now wished to suspend this practice, so that as many men as possible might serve as consuls, and he arranged for his resignation to take place outside the city, so that he should not be hindered in his purpose. He was praised both for his action in itself and because he chose Lucius Cestius to replace him. This man had always been an ardent supporter of Brutus, had fought with him in all his campaigns, and even at this time cherished his memory, possessed statues of him and delivered eulogies on him. It seems that Augustus, far from disapproving of Cestius's loyalty and attachment to his friend, honoured him for that reason. Because of this, the Senate passed a resolution that Augustus should be a tribune for life, and gave him the privilege of introducing before the Senate at each session any subject at whatever time he chose, even if he were not then consul. They also voted that he should hold once and for all, and for life, the office of proconsul, so that he should not be obliged either to lay it down on entering the city limits, or to have it renewed when he left them. And for the subject territories they granted him authority superior to that of governor in each locality. In consequence, both he and the succeeding emperors acquired a certain legal right to employ the tribunician power in addition to their other powers, for neither Augustus nor any other emperor used the title of tribune. Augustus's calling of a concilium, a kind of council, a practice in both family and official life, was a very republican thing to do. He thought he was dying, and so gave his consul Piso an appraisal of the state situation. The election of Piso himself was a sign of Augustus's loosening of his grip on the consulship, since the Calpurni Pisoni had neither been supporters of Augustus or Caesar, and now one of them was consul. His handing over of his signet ring to Agrippa meant that he was his heir to his estates and could have acted in his name, but he himself had no personal power. Agrippa was his closest friend and older and more experienced than Marcellus. At this juncture, it is important to think about what could have happened had Augustus died. Was Augustus emperor, as would be recognizable in the future Principate? No. There was nothing stopping his co-consul Piso restoring the Republic had Augustus died. Agrippa could have helped Piso do so, or fled, raised his armies and marched on Rome to establish his power. Considering Agrippa had none of the powers Augustus had, he would have had to build up his power from scratch. There was no Principate yet. Augustus's powers are all personal to him, and no other at this point. There were no institutions of the Principate set up that would last beyond Augustus's demise. In the long term, Marcellus was to be the designated successor of Augustus. He was his nephew and was married to Julia, Augustus's daughter. The fact that Augustus tried to show the Senate his will was likely a move to reassure the Senate that Augustus was not trying to establish a dynasty by making Marcellus or Agrippa his heir, although it probably said nothing indicative anyway, otherwise Augustus would never have flashed it in front of the Senate's faces. The death of Marcellus also likely laid to rest the Senate's fears that he was going to be Augustus's successor. It seems very unlikely that Agrippa and Augustus fell out over Marcellus, because 1. Augustus most likely would not have given Agrippa his ring, designating him his heir, and 2. He wouldn't have sent one of his enemies off to take command of the East, where a large concentration of Roman troops were positioned. Augustus probably sent Agrippa because he needed his best friend to make sure the East was secure, with the Parthians ready to pounce at any moment. His stationing himself at Lesbos would also mean that he could easily return to Italy should something happen to Augustus. In summary, here are the provisions of the Second Constitutional Settlement. Augustus, in his 11th consulship, resigned and was replaced by a Suffolk consul, Lucius Cestius. Cestius was a supporter of Brutus, who had assassinated Caesar. This may have been a concession to the members of the elite that had fought for the non-Caesarian armies during the civil wars. Augustus only took up the consulship again twice more, but that was more to introduce his grandsons into public life rather than the way he had been consul from 31 to 23 BC. Augustus declined the office of perpetual censor and instead appointed Aemilius Lepidus and Muntius Plancus as censors to carry out a lustrum. That is a religious ceremony that purified the city of Rome. These two men had been from proscribed families, so this was likely another concession to the senatorial class. They did no other acts other than the lustrum, but they would prove to be the last private censors. One of the powers of the censors was to introduce moral reforms, but they did not. This was something Augustus would do after 18 BC. He refused to be tribune of the plebs for life, but he accepted the power of a tribune, or tribunician potestas. This meant that 10 tribunes would be elected without Augustus needing to fill a post. Thus he did not have to worry about elections or breaking the rules of the lex annalis, but still had the power of that position. This was a new innovation. He could introduce whatever matter he wished in the Senate without being consul. This was likely to compensate him for holding the power of a junior magistracy, of tribune, allowing him to remain in the same speaking order in the Senate. Very importantly, he gained Maius Imperium Proconsulare, or greater proconsular power. This meant that he had the power of proconsul without restriction. He could cross the Pomerium, the city limits of Rome, without having to lay down his imperium nor did he need to renew it when leaving the Pomerium, and was granted authority superior to that of all other governors, meaning he could now legally interact with provincial governors outside of his own province. He also divided Spain into more provinces, now that he had conquered Calabria, and gave one to be a public province in 24 BC. Also in 23 BC, he handed back Cyprus and Gallia Narbonensis to the Senate as public provinces because they no longer needed his military protection. This may tie into the fact that his province was an emergency crisis command, and as they passed back into a sense of normalcy, he handed them back to the Senate. In some ways, Augustus had gained power, especially in the provinces, and personal power separate from the Republic. However, many historians such as Jones, Scullard, Syme and Richardson have stated that once he got the tribunician potestas, that Augustus gained more power than he had done in the first constitutional settlement, and that his autocracy was assured, and that was that. The issue is, why would Augustus need more power, when, from the first constitutional settlement, he clearly had too much power? In addition, how had he gained more power, when most of the provisions for the second settlement were just making official powers that he had or exercised anyway as consul? This settlement was intended to redress the issue of Augustus's power, and based on the events after 23 BC, it seems like it succeeded. His resignation as consul was a huge blow. A tribune never had as much power as a consul, and he had given up his domination of the consulship. In 23 BC, 2 people were consul that were not Augustus or one of his friends. He had no power over them either, since they were enemies of his family. And on the other side of the coin, they had as much power as him, since they were consul. Augustus himself almost never made use of his power as tribune. He never vetoed anything, which was a primary power of the tribune. He only used his power of tribune in 18 BC to pass his moral and social laws. He never used it beforehand or after. His imperium over his province was halfway over anyway, and unless he could get it extended, his power in the provinces would be at an end. Thus, I think it is fair to say that Augustus had actually lost power from the settlement. And we shall see in the next episode what the consequences of this were. Please do like, subscribe and share this video, and this has been Eastern Roman History.